So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the ancient and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It feels a terrible position beginning the last paper today, and I hope you'll bear with me because there's a lot of overlap with what other people have been saying, and we've just had these fantastic workshops. Okay. So in my presentation today, I draw on my professional anthropological So I'm often asked by younger anthropologists about the transferability of their anthropological skills and expertise outside of native title claims research. And there's been a lot to talk about that. And in my presentation today, I draw on my professional anthropology practice, those of my colleagues and scholarly literature, to discuss uses of anthropological expertise in environmental and cultural mapping landscapes in the post-determination space. In doing so, I'll touch on opportunities for anthropologists who want to work in these areas, challenges of doing so, and some current academic themes related to these fields. I'll first address uses of anthropological expertise in environmental landscapes before turning to cultural mapping. So in recent years, anthropologists have ventured out from anthropology sections of land councils and rep bodies to pursue other areas such as community development and archival returns projects. However, far fewer anthropologists have employed their skill set in the natural resource space. Yet, given Indigenous people's holistic conceptions of their landscape and the transformations of those landscapes, anthropology has much to offer land management projects concerned with interrelated natural and cultural values. Too often, however, narrow conceptions of an anthropologist's role in land management mean they may remain confined to established areas of work. But if we're concerned to retain young anthropologists in native title and post-determination areas, time spent working on other land management areas can broaden an individual's skill set and foster motivation. As an outsider consultant anthropologist, I've observed, for example, that anthropologists who have moved between anthropology sections at CLC and community development, who might otherwise have left the organisation, have tended to stay on. Career progression should be thought of not only in terms of vertical movement, but also as lateral growth. Given that few applied anthropologists move out of anthropology into dedicated land management sections, what are the barriers in doing so, and what can anthropology contribute to the field? To answer this question, it's important to first consider land management in the context of native title groups' needs and aspirations for healthy country and healthy people. Referred to as caring for country, Indigenous land management activities are diverse and may include cultural resource and heritage management, economic activities, endangered species management, and what conservationists refer to as abatement of threats, for example, wildfire and invasive species like buffelgrass. Such land management activities have long been of interest to PCBs, and in many of their plans, they're listed as among their top aspirations: resource management, cultural heritage, getting back on country. As many have observed, the land management goals of PCBs and their capacity to implement them will vary depending on factors such as the native title group's land tenure, financial resources, location of country, and neighbours, whether or not they're surrounded by pastoralists, national park, whatever. While First Nations people continue to care for country in their own ways, challenges such as remoteness from country and lack of skills and specialist knowledge to run programs mean that many native title groups engage with intercultural land management services and programs, as we've discussed this past 2 days. Areas in which PCBs can realise their land management aspirations include IPA and ranger programs and joint management arrangements. While many PCBs have their own ranger or land management program, it's estimated that about half the land services provided by land management sections of land councils, rep bodies, or independent land and sea management organisations. These include conservation organisations such as the Australian Wildlife Conservancy and charitable trusts like the Pew organisation. In terms of special skills, provision of land management services is commonly regarded as a preserve of ecologists, biologists, and land managers, managers with backgrounds in Western environmental science. Yet, although they have much needed natural resource management expertise, their knowledge of Indigenous relations to country, cultural traditions, protocols, and traditional governance systems may be limited. Gaps in this type of social and cultural knowledge can have consequences. Land management approaches which treat nature and culture separately do violence to Indigenous ways of being in country and conceptualising country holistically. Issues can arise when traditional ecological knowledge is essentialised and people's creative adaptations and changing interactions with their environments are ignored. Collaborative management arrangements can disempower groups through the imposition of Western governance frameworks that prioritise conservation objectives above other Indigenous interests. These and other kinds of issues associated with the provision of land management services have been taken up by academic anthropologists. For example, there's a critical strand of scholarship which argues that formalised structures such as Indigenous ranger groups can have negative impacts on Indigenous values and community engagement with country. On the other hand, there's an evolving literature that speaks to both positive aspects and the need to attend to the complexity of programs and their various approaches. Such academic scholarship can be used by applied anthropologists to identify factors leading to successful outcomes, illuminate problem areas, and help strengthen ranger, IPA, and other Indigenous land management programs. So while preparing for this presentation, it struck me how many senior anthropologists involved in CNTA have made scholarly contributions to Indigenous land management issues outside of the native title field. And Di Smith's work, as with his own governance, is notable in this regard. Smith and Jareth note that, quote, successful governance of Indigenous lands is one of the greatest challenges facing Indigenous people in Australia. Smith and Hunt developed a conceptual framework of Indigenous governance principles that is being used in the land management sector. For example, Bell Chambers reviewed 40 years of literature and identified 9 Indigenous governance principles that were shared amongst successful ranger groups and programs. Ensuring the application of such principles in land management programs is an area with which anthropologists can assist. Tony Bowman has written extensively on joint management as a process and identified success factors in joint management of protected areas. And I also, of course, should mention David Trigger's work on divisiveness and belonging. And in fact, looking at around the room, we heard from Kim DeRike on the mining industry. Richard Martin, Sarah Holcomb all contributed critical work in this area. In CNTA could have a one-day workshop, I think, on all these issues that I can only touch on here. But outside of the academic arena, what expertise and skill set can apply, or what I prefer to call engaged or practicing anthropologists, bring to the land management field, and how can they move into it? Well, I've had some anthropologists say they'd like to work in land management, but don't know anything about ecology or biology. But land management is not just about natural resources. Fundamentally, it's about people and country. Land management problems are solved by people. Anthropologists can play an important role in land management projects, whether in the context of IPAs, joint management, or other collaborative projects. Anthropologists in the native title sector have expertise in Indigenous cultural traditions, laws, customs, and in gaining their expertise, they work on country with TOs, recording sites, stories, dreamings, social organisation, etc. And since the Akiba native title case and the recognition of the right to take for any purpose resources in the native title, the right to take for any purpose resources in the native title areas, native title researchers' no course are now filled with information about Indigenous-wide cultural landscapes, that is, information related to types of country, plants and animals found there, their cosmological and relational significances, and people's use of resources. Such experience can usefully be employed by PCBs and land management organisations to facilitate cultural natural resource projects and ensure that native title holders' knowledge, values and concerns are prioritised. And a recent example that comes to mind is Ham Corbett, who I think is in the room, who worked as a regional anthropologist at CLC and now works as heritage manager for Jamu Jamu Aboriginal Corporation at Kiwikora. Another example is Bill Cruz, who was a senior anthropologist at KLC for many years, currently working with the Pew Charitable Trusts. And I spoke with him recently and asked him about his experience moving or transitioning, as he phrased it, into the land management field. Reflecting on his motivation, he said that it was as an anthropologist working for KLC when he was frequently on country, documenting site knowledge, histories, and people's interactions with countries. He saw in the desert areas people actively managing their land, and he took a really keen interest in it, asked a lot of questions, and left the KLC, moved to Manajara Council, and he started working with Madu in the Wooloona area. And this is a long time before IPAs, and he saw that the PCB didn't have any money to enable people to exercise their native title rights. So he organised at the time, the WA Department of Conservation wanted to establish a national park, but they had no relationship with Indigenous people in the area. And so Bill organised an MOU with the department and the PCB that resulted in funding for people to get out on country and manage their land. So this was over 20 years ago, before IPAs got off the ground. And since then, Bill's worked in helping develop the Margaret and Kurra National Park Co-Management Plan framework. And as I said, much has changed since then. In 2023, the National Park became a co-managed park involving Māori partnering with the WA government. And according to Q, the National Park is, quote, a model of how to combine science and Indigenous knowledge to preserve biodiversity. But it's the work of anthropologists such as Bill that's essential to achieving native title outcomes for native title holders and prioritising their interests. So anthropologists can use their skill set in the land management sector in yet other ways to those I've mentioned. Anthropology is concerned with understanding cultural difference and values, beliefs, and perceptions that shape people's interactions with their environments. And to do this, of course, we'll use methods such as participant observation, interviews, etc. Our analysis and description of cultural values, perceptions, etc., involves us in the process of translation between different bodies of knowledge. And I've drawn on my anthropological training in my own professional practice to carry out work in the land management field, although I've not transitioned like Bill. Over the years, I've worked with several cross-disciplinary teams on some major projects. For example, in 2007, I was engaged by the Desert Knowledge Cooperative Research Centre as part of an interdisciplinary team to examine the feral camel situation in Central Australia. I was the only anthropologist. The team was composed of ecologists, GIS specialists, and economists. And my role was to conduct research on Indigenous perceptions of free-ranging camels. So I conducted a qualitative survey in 25 Aboriginal communities in the cross-border region in Central Australia, and took focus groups, interviews, and fieldwork for 2 in-depth case studies. And at the time, there was an estimated 700,000 to 1 million camels in the area. And in times of drought, they would come into communities and they were perceived to create harms. And they were doing things like ripping taps and air conditioners of houses in certain areas in these drought times. But the dominant narrative at the time was that Aboriginal people regarded camels as belonging to country and did not want to adopt measures to manage the animals, and it was seen as a sort of very difficult space. But among other things, my analysis of data that I collected showed Aboriginal people's perceptions of camels and their impacts were not homogenous. People held different views as to whether they belonged or not, and their reviews revealed intertwining socio-cultural and environmental dimensions that reflected their nature, culture, ontological relations, historical relations, and present-day interactions. The work was subsequently drawn on by land management sections of different land councils across the borders to inform their consultations with TOs concerning camel management strategies. And I just mention this because it's one way that anthropologists can kind of value add to this section and really be useful to this kind of work. I've also worked on Indigenous fire management projects and currently looking at Indigenous fire governance structures and how it is that you can implement the land councils, the rep bodies, cross-border, involving different legislations, different Indigenous groups, etc., how they can manage broad-scale fire management and plan it. And we're talking about, hundreds of thousands of square kilometres, and how it is that people's interest in land cannot be overlooked, and how through that process you can actually get people back on country and involved in combined TO ranger projects that also got anthropologists involved at the same time, using things like helicopters, which is what I've done, so the fire people can go out, drop aerial incendiaries of the rangers half the day, and then I would go ask an anthropologist on a cultural mapping trip and go out with TOs in the afternoon, and we'd visit sites in inaccessible areas in sandhills and do cultural mapping. Okay, so what kind of challenges do anthropologists face working in land management space? Well, you'll be working with staff with environmental science backgrounds, and environmental science, like anthropology, is a distinct discipline with a body of knowledge and ways of knowing about the world. And it's important to respect their knowledge, their methodologies, be open and step out of your comfort zone. At the same time, tensions can arise because of different approaches of the two disciplines. For example, while anthropologists are used to dealing with complexity and uncertainty, some environmental scientists find this difficult. And often they'll say, oh, here comes the anthropologist. I'll take them out. I know that some anthropological and land management sections of land councils can operate like silos. And depending on where you're situated, it can be hard to bring people together and bridge perspectives. Creating trust and good relations is essential, but placing native title holders' land management aspirations at the forefront of any work goes a long way towards ensuring successful interdisciplinary collaboration. And what I'd say to young anthropologists, although there doesn't seem to be that many really young ones in the room, is take a keen interest in approaches, read the background literature, grab every opportunity you have to participate in on-country combined visits with different disciplines and TOs. So while there are different models for and names of cultural a major concern of First Nations people is ensuring knowledge and practices associated with their cultural heritage is passed on to younger generations. This goal is in fact written into many current Healthy Country, Healthy People land management plans. While there are different models for and names of cultural mapping projects, many native title groups are wanting to undertake cultural mapping projects that involve younger people learning from elders and recording place names, stories, histories, and biocultural information while on country. With their experience of mapping, anthropologists are ideally placed to assist PCBs and independent groups to undertake such projects. And as I've mentioned, I've been involved in such a project over several years with working with Wanderwalbri people in the Tanami Desert of the NT and with my anthropology colleague, Luke Kelly. And the project involves the integration of prior recorded material from land claims and other projects, as well as the recording of new material. And many of you know Kimber Hood's mapping work, and recently she's conducted canvas map painting workshop as part of the mapping project. But one of the major aims, someone asked me the other day, what are the outcomes of this project? The major outcome is actually the process itself. It's getting people out on country, older people with young people, so that knowledge becomes embodied knowledge, not just sitting on a computer or a map somewhere. And while we've got maps of all sorts, including big, place names maps as big as this, and all sorts of other maps that we're developing with Kim McCord, that, in my view, is the major value of it. And many anthropologists that have worked in other areas in the Central Land Council region and come to work with the land of Albury are just stunned by the amount of knowledge that these younger people have of their country. Okay. So although Indigenous cultural mapping is a relatively recent development in Australia, it's now a hot topic for anthropological inquiry. For example, there are currently 3 cultural mapping projects, research projects underway involving anthropologists in the top end of the NT. Many of you will know anthropologist Sam Williams, who's conducting PhD research on the topic. Howard and Francis Morphy have an ARC discovery grant to research and map place names and personal names in Yolngu society and country in Northeast Arnhem. Jennifer Degar has an ARC grant to make living maps for Yolngu at West Miaka. Last year, anthropologist Dr. Sarah Holcomb at the University of Queensland undertook a desktop review of Indigenous cultural mapping for the First Nations Heritage Protection Alliance. As part of the review, she interviewed anthropologists from NTRBs across Australia and found that although a few NTRBs said they do some kind of cultural mapping, quote, there is limited integration of these knowledges within and across the organisations, end of quote. Sarah found that most NTRBs don't use the term cultural mapping and are not resourced to undertake it. As one staff member told her, we're working in a narrow framework, but we need to perhaps challenge that. Depending on how you define cultural mapping, it has the potential for traditional owners to reclaim culture and for repatriation programs of land claim and native title claim materials to be supported. And of course, that's something that Kevin Smith commented on and spoke to this morning. It's an area that warrants greater involvement from anthropologists, rep bodies, land councils, and other organisations working with PCBs in the land management space. And I know you're all really tired, so I'm actually going to conclude with that and see if there's any comments or questions. Actually, is Michael Lucas here? Yeah, Michael, we had a bit of a talk this morning. I just want to.
Thanks, Petronella. Just following on from our discussion, I showed obviously income data earlier, but employment data shows that co-management agreements are amongst the biggest drive of employees amongst PBCs. And so on that employment end of these co-management agreements that you've spoken about, stacked up on the data side as well. So I really support everything you said.
Yeah. Another interesting thing, I think, thank you, Michael, is that someone told me who's working in the sector that contract conservation industry has some of the largest contracts in Australia, and this is an area that really anthropologists should be getting into because it just focuses so much on the natural resources without the cultural side. Is Di Smith here? If you could just make a comment about how the aspirations of land management, with the group that you're working with, how does that gel?
It gels. It totally aligns with what you've presented in the sense that the QSNTS, their program, People, Place and Partnership. So they've been doing they've had kind of dozens of workshops last year. A big one was aspirations. So every PEC went through what are your aspirations, and we all say every side, kind of no common size, but the commonality across all was country, land and waters, people relations, getting them back onto country, and knowledge transition. So getting people back onto country was getting older people back, younger people back, and coming out of the native title claim shoot, really wanting to reclaim and rebuild and pass on knowledge. So a lot of contestation about who knows about what, that was there during the claim process. People wanted to go back out into country with families and have that as a learning on country experience, which is that embodiment of, you learn by doing and seeing and, kind of from older people. So, yeah. And I think just in recognition of the fact that with PVCs, they're now native title holders, I think it's really nice to, in that context, in that arena, for us to be actually starting to talk about land governance.
Yeah.
They are governing. They're trying to govern their rights and interests with respect to lands and waters. But those things were top three.
Yeah.
Country, people, and knowledge. And some of it in the CRC was talking a lovely story about one of the translators that they were working with to doing part of that at PVC. What was it? People belonging to country. That's what a PVC is. And that's exactly the priorities that came out of all of those 14 workshops with different PVCs.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for that talk, Petronella. It's really good. And I think it raises the point, and I want to raise the point about how fundamental cultural mapping projects are to all spheres of kind of native title and land management. So if you do the project at the start, or you start the project, we're doing a process of people being able to go back on country, which is what you noted. We're knowing we can't manage what we don't know anything out there. We're preserving cultural knowledge, language, and connection to country. And it also helps in the future act space and the agreement making space. So we know what's out there before we're getting hit with notifications, agreements, people wanting to go out and do activity. And of course, it helps in the cultural management space because before they're going out and looking at development, exploration and surveys, people have that knowledge pre-hand and are able to respond much more quickly and appropriately. So it just seems to have such a benefit across every facet of what we do. And so I just want to note that.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, Nova.
Thank you, Petronella. I kind of wanted to ask Hannah a question and put you on the spot, and maybe other people can answer this. But my question kind of aimed more at, I guess, the IPA, the land management, environmental side of things, and coming from a context of working at Kiwikura and desert places where the cultural mapping stuff happened as part of the claims process many years ago. People have kind of remained on their country, know that country, live on that country. So that side of stuff is kind of is already there in second nature. But then the IPA becomes the way in which people are funded to get back out on country. How much does the kind of outcomes that the IPAs, the environmental outcomes that the IPAs require for that funding to continue, how much does that actually kind of inspire people, work with people's other agendas for wanting to be out on country? I'm curious about if that is actually as good as a fit as the government tries to sell it.
Good question. I'm also not the IPA coordinator, so I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that question. But my experience with working with the IPA team out in Kiwikura is that, as Petronella said, it is so integrated. People's, their engagement with country, their connection to country, you can't really separate out those cultural values with a lot of the environmental, nature-based stuff. So, yeah, what I've seen out there is it is fully integrated. The women are out there doing land management stuff, protecting endangered species, burning, visiting cultural sites, the intergenerational transfer of knowledge. It's just all one big package. So yeah, I don't really know how the government is presenting it, but yeah, definitely out in Kimikura, where you've got that group of people who have maintained that long-term connection to country. I mean, people are going out every day to go hunting. They're constantly out there visiting sites, telling those stories. I don't know if that answered your question, but
I think just to add to Hannah's, I think it also has got to do with governance. Like I've seen different models of how these IPAs operate and whether they've got kind of IPA advisory committees and who that are, made up of TOs, etc. And there's often a sort of a triangular relationship. And governance is a major aspect of this.
Thanks, Petronella. This is going to be a surprising question, I guess, and possible to answer in a quick way. So don't worry. But I'll ask it anyway. Do you reckon that anthropologists, it's good for anthropologists as well, doing this work in their own sense of building senses of place and senses of belonging and knowledge of the bush and species and so on? I know it's somewhat of a rhetorical question, but for a while, a few of us have been interested in this topic, that it's asking why anthropologists do this work for their own benefits as well as all of the other stuff that we've been talking about here. So sorry if it's an out of left field question, but for people such as yourself who've been in the game a long time, be interested to hear if it's been good for you to do this cultural mapping work.
It's a complex answer. So, and it's one I've been thinking about a lot lately, actually. Look, I feel unbelievably privileged I've worked with many groups. I've worked on, I don't know, over 13, 14, 15 Aboriginal land claims and native title claims and all sorts of different projects, etc. But I've maintained a relationship with a group that I went to as a school teacher when I was 20 years of age. And, they're very much part of my life in many ways. And that's often complex. One of the senior men that is involved in the cultural mapping project just died at Christmas, and he and I have had a very long life and a time working together. And that's really floored me, but we've collected all this amazing information. But when I say we, I mean younger people have been out there recording it. We've got it in the learning centre. It's in all different kind of ways. I'm just so pleased looking at it that they embody so much of this knowledge. But I've also got so much of this knowledge as well, and you think about, well, what if I retire? Like, I've got all this knowledge. It's like, and for me, I think absolutely, it's a sense of place that you get in relationship with people here, doing this kind of work. It's incredibly enriching and satisfying. I mean, I wouldn't have done it unless I found it absolutely intellectually engaging as well. Does that cover it?
Thanks very much.
The talk earlier talked about Kirikora. It reminded me of 3 days that I used to work out there quite a long time ago, and they were 3 of the most extraordinary days of my working life. And it showed how the returning to country, the assisting people to go into country has wider governance implications, because the 2 old men that I spent the whole day before, there was going to be a meeting of entities all over the place, and they knew that everyone that came was going to be voted together from this money that was going to be coming from exploration. And we sat together and talked, and for the day before,
And through that process, they came up with looking after a country and looking after the country, which sounds banal. But the next morning, as the serried ranks of Toyotas drew up, people out were standing there, talking about getting their Toyota to drive around Balgo or something like that. These old guys would just laugh, quite, steering their eyes and say, well, no, you can't do that. You can't use this money there. If you want the money, then you can pay for petrol to bring your car here, bring your young people here, put them through ceremony for the boys, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, even those far away, hundreds and hundreds of kilometres away, the resources coming in were to be used to extend, to build up, to maintain these nexus between those people and country. So the governance worked in all kinds of interesting ways. And the last I heard, there's a number of people here who know the update. I don't. But that kind of principle was a really successful way. It's kind of axiomatic. People didn't have a moral basis to ask for money for Baldo or whatever else.
Thanks, David. Just going back to your question, David, I think it's also important for me to state that because I've got such a long, strong relationship doesn't mean I also can't work as an anthropologist with impartiality in different things. Like I've just done a native title claim with the group and I'm about to do another one. It doesn't at all make me think I've got to, prioritize one group over another. I mean, I'm just work as a professional anthropologist in that area.
I've just got the microphone back again because I just thought I'd give David a little update on that because that was really interesting to hear. And it's something that I still experience out in Kiwikura now. It's something that people talk about, that idea of a holding country and your presence on country legitimizes your ability to be making decisions and to benefit from that. So it's a big concept still in P2P governance and incorporated into the way the corporation operates. And in a lot of ways, I feel like that's how, why they fought, the P2P fought so hard to get their PVC in Kiwikura. It made sense. It didn't make sense for it to be run out of Perth and outside of community. And I think it's just an extension of that strong sense of identity and belonging and self-determination that's always been kind of the essence of the Pintupi story. So I don't know, I thought you might like to hear that it's still there.